We can talk about anything and everything cloud. So I'm going to introduce myself first. I am Edwin David. I work in our Force Cloud consulting practice. I primarily do Azure penetration testing. We are joined with my practice lead is actually just joining just now. We are joined by Mike Felch. He primarily focuses on GCP and OCI. And then we have Patrick Mayo. He primarily focuses with our AWS testing. And we do have a latecomer joining us, our practice lead, Paul Burkeland. He runs our Force Cloud practice. So we're kind of here to get started. And at any time, feel free to send in your questions. We will get them answered to the best of our ability. So with that being said, I'm going to lead off just with a generalized question, and I'll just focus my answer really just kind of on the Azure side. And then we'll just kind of roundtable it from there. And as questions come in, we'll take a pause because we're here for you, and we're definitely here to answer your questions. So the first question that I'm just going to lead off with is, what is the most valuable approach to pen testing cloud assets? And for Azure, we kind of take the approach of pen testing cloud from a couple different angles. Obviously, any attacker is probably going to start from an unauthenticated perspective. They're going to do their OSINT research, all their recon, seeing how many users exist in a tenant, what they can do. Attackers obviously probably they gravitate more towards social engineering than probably password spraying. But as we kind of seen with other threat actors such as Midnight Blizzard, password spraying is still a very, very effective tool to get into cloud tenants and gain some persistence into those areas. But one of the things that, at least on the Azure side, that I just wanted to mention was that the best thing that anyone can do, especially if you want to get your assets pen tested in cloud, is an assumed breach. And assumed breach can have a couple different things. We can obviously start off as a low privileged employee, malicious insider. Hey, here's where you are. We're going to drop you in here. Let's see how high you can get. And we definitely take that approach if password spraying is not a viable option, because in Azure, we do run into things such as Azure Smart Lockout, and then we're kind of gridlocked from there. Or B, maybe we do land on some credentials, but in the MFA landscape, that has drastically changed within the past couple of years on what Microsoft has done to move people away from MFA push notifications if that is the preferred method that if you are using the Microsoft IDP provider, that's a lot of people gravitate to the MFA Authenticator app, and number matching has killed a lot of possibilities for us in terms of password spraying. Still doesn't mean we can't get in. Sometimes we find certain areas of Azure unsecured where maybe we'll land on a graph endpoint that is not protected by MFA because somebody has configured conditional access for certain cloud workloads instead of all cloud apps, which does happen very frequently. So
So to jump in there and to tie on to what Edwin's saying there is that, yeah, so externals have gotten a lot harder because of things like smart lockout and conditional access and MFA being more widely deployed. The banned password list, of course, also can be a deterrent there for keeping attackers from getting in. So I think that some of the best ways that you can approach cloud pen testing now is not to focus on a solo cloud pen test, but to mix and match it with another aspect of the engagement. So, right, because all of our cloud stuff almost never exists in like a silo where it's not connected to anything. Almost always you have either a VPN back to on-premises, you're going to have different maybe identity providers tied in, you're going to have different things that interact with the cloud. And so a lot of the times, looking at it from an external perspective, it might be locked down. But from on premises, they've already allow listed access to different cloud resources. Maybe they don't have MFA because you don't want to be prompted for MFA when you're coming from on site. So I think it's a lot of the times beneficial to add an internal component with the cloud pen test, because now you can see what would a user have from this kind of juicier standpoint, where they might already have some creds, they might have some access to cloud, but they might not have full access. They might just have ownership of a few resources, something like that. Or conversely, from the other side of it, from outside, you might want to mix and match some social engineering along with an external cloud, or with a cloud pen test, allow some of that token theft, and seeing if you're set up to resist it, what would happen if somebody captured a token of one of your users. So to me, I think the greatest thing you can do is to combine a couple different areas for cloud pen testing. And that's going to get you the most value, I think. There's still definitely value in doing just a cloud pen test, but the things you're going to find, I think, are going to tend to be more on the configuration side of things, than on a lot of full paths through the cloud that way. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, to add on a little bit more to that as well, with the adding different components, it may be like a cloud pen test, or also part of an internal, because we've seen cases where you can get compromised the AD internally or additional resources internally, but then if it's just an internal test, we're not necessarily pivoting as well as we could into AWS, cloud, Azure, GCP, what have you. So whether we do that from an internal or from like an AWS to an Azure to a GCP, perhaps, combining those in different interesting ways that represent the holistic view of your environment can let us provide those cross area lateral movement points. And kind of along with the question in chat there for the guest access, we do that some with the additional access for testing from like a specific user or a specific service or a role that you might have a area of concern about. So we can then like mirror a role in AWS, or gain access to a specific IAM user's similar permissions, and be able to replicate that during and as an attack path if that were to become compromised.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to the GCP side as well. I mean, a lot of times we'll see infrastructure running in GCP, and they're using like Google Workspace for like the platform collaboration side. And a lot of times they're running authentication through like Google Workspace in order to authenticate into the development environments or the infrastructure side of GCP. And those two are so intertwined, but a lot of times we really want to try to focus on testing both, because there's different aspects of Google Workspace that could lead to a lateral movement into the infrastructure. For instance, spinning up Google groups. Sometimes they'll, like DevOps teams will spin up a specific Google group and they'll use that as their distribution email for cron tab logs. But those cron tab logs are being generated from the infrastructure side, so there's a lot of crossover there. So depending on how you have your environment set up and provisioned, usually starting from like an assumed breach perspective with GCP really makes sense as well. And really just starting from like a read-only perspective is pretty standard, but a lot of times, like what Patrick was saying, it's hey, they want to simulate this web application that's running in GCP. So they'll create like a standard user account with the permissions that mimic or mirror that application, and then we'll start from that assumed perspective in order to kind of to assess the environment.
So we do have one question that came in. I'll go ahead and read it. Does TrustedSec team recommend resources for testing Microsoft guest access from the perspective of a compromised guest account, more of an assumed breach scenario? So when I am on a cloud pen test, regardless whether it's a hybrid pen test or just specifically cloud, if I am in a assumed breach scenario, I will absolutely try and add another account as like a guest and see if I can get in. And what we really kind of like to show there is how much access does that guest really have? Is there an over provisioning of resources? I have never specifically been given an assumed breach scenario where they give me just guest only access and they see how much that I want to get in from there. Because by default, unless somebody goes in and changes the Entra ID defaults, you still are somewhat constrained on the amount of resources that you can see. We definitely have our ways of being able to see not only the guest account, but we do have ways of actually extracting all the users in the Entra ID environment still, and we can still do that. But that's one of those settings that is somewhat a little bit more locked down than some of the other settings. But I specifically have not. I specifically is not. I haven't been approached with that assumed breach scenario. From my perspective, I think it would be you're spending a lot of money on a cloud pen test or even a hybrid. And if somebody drops us into that, it may be a light report and it may not be very fruitful for the client. So that's why I'd probably highly suggest that if somebody is thinking about an assumed breach scenario, that we get dropped in as like a standard like low privileged user, that's probably where you're going to find some value. You're definitely going to find some value with generic read access across the board in the Azure cloud. And the reason why I say that's valuable as well, we have to really kind of cover ourselves to make sure that we're testing assets that belong to the client. But more importantly, we're given a week. So, regular attackers can have months and months and months of preparation. And unfortunately, we get a week, and we want to make sure that clients get true value out of their cloud pen tests. So from an assumed breach perspective, that's really kind of my go-to is a low privileged user perspective first. I don't know if Mike or Patrick or Paul, I don't know if either of you three have anything additional to add on there or from your respective areas.
So testing from guest access, I think it's valuable because we're seeing a lot more people use guests in Azure as a way of. However, I'm not sure that. Yeah, I don't know. I'd start with that. I definitely think it'd be a good scenario to add into a test. Now, by default, guests are allowed some good permissions in Azure, right? You're able to not only see directory objects, but you can also invite other guests. And so if you have, in particular, the one thing I see with guests is dynamic group memberships, right? If you can look at the group memberships or the groups that are in place and find dynamic groups, you may be able to take advantage of that with the guest account because if they're using anything that relies on the user principal name, guest accounts are something that a user can control and match different things. So like maybe they have -admin and they're using -admin as an indicator that it's part of an admin group. I can invite a guest that is, test user -admin at my own domain. And now I log in, that user principal name matches -admin. And I am now able to use that to, access resources that you might not have intended. Otherwise, guests are pretty much normal users there. But definitely something to lock down. I don't know if I'd do a whole breach around it, but I would definitely at least look at it a little bit to see what they could have access to. There's just not a whole ton of pivot points there.
So
GCP doesn't have a lot for guest access from the traditional sense. I mean, there's some ways you could invite users into kind of the organization. So that's not really super applicable. And then, in fact, in some cases, there are IAM users that I'm looking for to determine whether or not any of those IAM users are using non-corporate login credentials, because usually that might be an indicator that something else is going on. But we don't really test from that perspective.
So then, sorry, go
No,
on.
you're good. Go ahead.
I was just, unless you had something to add on, Paul, I was going to read the next question or, yeah, okay. So pivots between platforms are a great point on how cloud assessments are maturing. Do you find yourself reviewing identity configs like SAML, OAuth, for example, Okta, but also others? I personally, I would say absolutely. I run into Okta all the time. I run into very different and weird situations with that identity provider. I've also ran into other things where, like, for example, SAML authentication and definitely single sign-on is It's a very common setup because you have sysadmins that just don't want to disable accounts to 40 different apps when they can do it from a single point of truth. But on the flip side of that, attackers have been taking advantage of that. One of the ones that really kind of comes to mind for me is Scattered Spider, where they're able to gain entry into an account and maybe they're able to use a user agent or another method of gaining access to either like an access token or using a user agent switch and completely bypassing the MFA process. And then now all of a sudden you have an attacker, instead of just running into one application, they now have access to maybe over 50 applications, which can definitely be problematic. So we do get approached to with like custom tests and so forth to make sure that MFA is really kind of activating in all of those scenarios, because the last thing that you want is something that may be relatively untested across your IT crew, and then either an attacker or or someone like us comes in, and then we're able to find a gap that sets off a problem that needs to be fixed. Patrick,
Yeah.
Mike.
I generally test a lot look at a lot of the IAM roles and the trust relationship policies that are configured in client environments for SAML configurations, OIDC, auth, and everything, because a lot of times they are set up to use SSO providers like Okta or Microsoft or an on-premise one. And that's great, but I also check for potential misconfigurations for more third-party providers for more automation. So like GitHub's runners and everything, you can configure those to assume an IAM role to deploy your code or whatever you're doing. And the same with like Bitbucket and other code repositories that have pipeline support. I'll check for those to see if any of those might be overly permissive that might allow any organization, any project, any repo in those code repositories, hosting services to assume that role and use that as a way into the account. So we'll check those as well as just to see if there's any that are just widely defined. So maybe like have like AWS principal with star or like a few numbers and star. So that could potentially be another way that an attacker could try to get in by assuming that role. So we'll check for those.
Yeah, on the GCP side, I think a lot of it that I've seen is mainly tied to workspace. I mean, I know that I've seen Okta in use and some of these other SSO providers or kind of mechanisms that are in place. But I think a lot of the ones that I've actually recognized in GCP engagements are kind of built around just Google Workspace accounts and kind of traveling it in there. I will say on this though, with how it is maturing on the cloud side, the integrations are really getting popular. So there's a lot of third-party integrations, and while I know the question was kind of built more around SSO and kind of on the authentication side, I will say I do also look for opportunities to laterally move or pivot into third-party integrations, because sometimes these are already kind of tightly wound together. They'll spin up a service account in GCP, and then they'll use that service account to kind of manage some other third-party integration that they're using. And if I could find an attack path that'll leverage that existing relationship with the third party, we outline it in the kickoff call too, just to make sure that we're clear that we're not exploiting the third party services, like as it relates to the infrastructure on the third party, but we will definitely leverage a third party attack path that is using like an existing privilege that I was able to gain. So can we, leverage the GCP access that we have that we've compromised to laterally move into like an AWS environment, or even into Slack notifications or something where I could, retrieve some sort of API access to these other third-party integrations. Another real big one is like CI/CD pipelines. This is huge because a lot of the GCP is using infrastructure for build pipelines or for DevOps, or they're using them for like build runners in their GitHub. Well, if you can compromise some sort of endpoint within the GCP environment that gives you access to a GitHub runner, well, now you have a lateral movement into the code repository. potentially the vault, the deployments. And so there's a whole new category of attack paths that I think is commonly overlooked, that I don't think the industry as a whole pays enough attention to. That I usually start. Actually, I usually land in GCP from those, but it goes both ways. The relationship there on the authentication side. So yeah, very valuable on the maturity there.
I did want to mention too, one provider that I kind of skipped. ADFS is still out there. We definitely still see it. Before I even touch an environment, before I even password spray an environment, AD Internals has a lovely little feature where I can recon as an outsider. And aside from me reconning all the domains that exist in the Entra ID tenant, it tells me who it's federated with immediately, whether it's Okta. But I'm pointing out ADFS because that is still a very popular provider, and a lot of enterprises are still using ADFS. And one of the typical things that I find with ADFS environments, we'll use a tool to actually see if any NTLM authentication gaps exist within the ADFS setups. That is probably one of my most favorite platforms to password spray. And the reason why I say that is generally we're not dealing with smart lockout in those situations, because it's using a legacy form of authentication. And then we're commonly not dealing with MFA either. So we can continually brute force an ADFS environment throughout the engagement. And, one of the things I wanted to particularly just kind of say was, besides rotating IP addresses, I know me personally, I was in a situation where I was getting accounts back, and I wasn't hearing anything out of anybody. And then I started lowering the bar of my attacks, where I was just doing a single brute force spray on one IP address, and that was still getting undetected. So ADFS is still another popular provider too that should absolutely be looked at. So if you're on this call and you're using ADFS with your cloud authentication, that is definitely something that we like to look at and do as well.
And because there may not be banned password enforcement on ADFS.
Yep. Yeah, so absolutely. Just lots of perspectives there.
I'm gonna chime in on that real quick. I'm gonna piggyback that on actually on the AWS side. So forgive me, Patrick, for overstepping into the AWS realm real quick. But one thing that I always look for in AWS is whether they're using built-in IAM user accounts, because AWS actually doesn't have a password lockout policy. So you could literally just brute force passwords on IAM accounts and not have to worry about lockout.
So we had another question come in their Azure realm. What are the success and failure ratios in Azure penetration testing? And what are the common problems and misconfigurations encountered during these tests? So a couple different things. Yep, Paul, you can.
I would say
define
success. Define success in an Azure cloud pen test. Like, what are you expecting out of it right there? I mean, that I think is the biggest question. Because do we find things that will help your environment? Almost always. Do we get DA or enterprise admin or global admin from it? That's more variable. So
only if you're Edwin.
Yeah, yes. No, I mean, I would say that, yeah, getting full compromise from a cloud pen test, it depends on what services you're using a lot. But I would say overall, it's less common than on an internal, for instance. On an internal, you're almost always guaranteed to, not always, but a lot of the times to get DA or close to it. On a cloud pen test, depending on what they're using, there might be much smaller chances of that. But I'd say almost always, unless you have a really spotless config, there's almost always areas for improvement that you can improve things that attackers will use, and you'll find real value in. So anyways, that's all. I'll hand it back to you, Edwin.
No, and just to really just kind of piggyback off that too, whenever I go into a new cloud pen test each week, To be honest with everyone on this call, my goal is not global admin. Global admins are, for the most part, they're typically well protected. 50/50, whether they're segmented specifically as a cloud only. Sometimes I do see that they are synced to Active Directory, which is a little less desirable. But generally overall, those are probably your most hardened accounts that we may encounter. Unless for some weird reason we find like a SharePoint document with a generic service account that's in plain text that holds a GA role. 9 times out of 10, that never happens.
Or you might find a logic app with it in there, something like that. But
yeah, exactly. So one of the things that my primary goals that I have whenever I'm going on a pen test or a cloud pen test is I look to see if I can get subscription access. And by subscription access, I mean ownership access, because for me, that is probably the next best thing as opposed to a GA, is whenever you're actually able to start taking over cloud assets. And that opens a lot more possibilities, even from an external portal perspective, because you have things that you can do now, such as like Azure run commands against VMs, and you can pivot internally. I've been able to do that. It is wild to see that whenever somebody has you doing a cloud pen test, and then all of a sudden you're dumping their domain from a cloud portal perspective. So that's kind of my, I guess, nutshell answer of a success and failure. Sorry, go on.
no, you're good. So I was just going to say, to add on to that now. So the second part of the question was, what are the most common problems and misconfigurations you encounter? So this kind of is one thing, is that plain text credentials stored improperly, whether it's inside of a script, like maybe they did a lift and shift from on-premises. That's really the most common thing by far, I think, that we see, is people take code that's fine if you're on premises in an isolated network, maybe not fine, but it's passable. But now they put it into the cloud. They just copy their Python code and throw it in here, and maybe it has a hard-coded cred, or they're doing something else, PowerShell with a hard-coded credential in there, something. And that's hard-coded creds, or creds in SharePoint or environmental variables, anywhere that they're not supposed to be in plain text. That's the biggest thing, I think, by far, that we see overall cloud environments. But yeah, and then that kind of ties in with what's the most common problems and misconfiguration. So yeah, that's what I would say it is for that aspect of it.
Yeah, it's definitely the same on GCP and OCI as well. I mean, it's creds are king.
Yeah, it's not just
it's
Sorry,
using the
go
cred
ahead.
to kind of using creds to kind of leverage them and get additional accesses, and potentially update running configurations if needed, or inject code into a function or an EC2 if that's what you have permissions to do. It kind of depends on what's discovered and where you can go with it. But it's also, the most important thing is identifying those potential high-risk attack paths and privileged escalation paths, because without knowing those, they're just left out there for someone else to find out and use in a bad way.
And just to kind of mention too, with hard-coded creds, it's just not for Azure, it's just not just like service accounts or whatever. It can be third-party applications that have client ID and secrets in plain text. We will absolutely use those as well, because there are ways of authenticating as those users. And generally, if you don't have a higher form of licensing, we really don't encounter any type of barrier restrictions as far as where we're coming from to use those creds and kind of escalate privileges as well.
Real quick before we move on to the AWS side, I just want to share kind of like a little story about that. One of the most fun engagements I had was where I had found hard-coded credentials. And the great thing is, when you find them, there's no indicator that you found them, right? It's not like you tried to log in with them from somewhere. So you just have them in your back pocket, basically. I got evicted from this Azure tenant 2 times, and I was able to come back and restore my account, just to prove that I could restore my original account 2 times in a row, because I had creds that I had found internally in different run books and whatnot. And so the real danger there is that, yeah, these are sitting out there, and there's almost no way to tell that somebody has them. They might just be holding on to them, waiting to come back into your tenant after you kicked them out the first time. So Yeah. So with that, I think we can move over though to the AWS side of things now. The next question was, how common is it to do a full compromise from a starting point in AWS? So Patrick or Mike, would you like to speak to that? Oh, Patrick, I think you're muted still.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think it's commonality. It depends on the environment. Some customers that can happen for sure. We can get in there and find credentials, find something that we can assume or leverage or inject code into that provides additional access and pivot into a different account. But I think it becomes a question of like, what's the most important value to the customer from that way? Because we can potentially find a way to compromise this account, but if we're testing 15 accounts and we compromise the one dev account where most devs already have near admin anyway, it's kind of like, not that much of a value, because then if you can't really get out of that into the other accounts, like the prod or the security account that would have a higher operational value, then it's not a full thing. And then it becomes a question of, well, does compromising the entire environment be the end goal? And I think it's just more so about where the data for the customer is being housed, where their processes are being, the compute is running for all their processes, and what can touch those, and how an attacker could potentially poison that, or steal, or compromise in some different way in order to have a negative impact against the customer. So like getting admin in an account or two may be possible, but it may not be the end goal of what's best.
Cool. That so I guess I want to touch on this next one here from Brad. Unless Mike, did you have anything to add to that? Sorry.
No, I'm
So
good. GCP, you rarely own everything.
yeah. So this next question is particularly near and dear to me, and I want to just speak on it real quick. It's the question is that, do you think there will ever come a day when Microsoft switches to the mindset of secured configurations by default instead of saying, sure, you can secure it, but we want to make it nice and easy and convenient instead. So will they ever switch from that mindset? I don't think so, unfortunately. I think something is going to have to happen, like where they say, oh, we really got bit bad by this, or something, where for them to actually change it, because they know about this. They know about all this. And it really makes me upset, because it's the companies that can't afford to fix it that hurt the most. It's the people that don't have the resources. It's the companies that are, nonprofits, educational, K through 12, all those places that don't have, thousands of dollars to devote to a pen test or to hire somebody to do this. And they're the ones that really get screwed over by this. It's all the Fortune 500 companies, those are going to have it patched because they have pen tests all the time. So they're not getting hurt by any of this bad, stuff that Microsoft's doing. They're going to be fine. But it's all these other companies that rely on it and trust that there's secure settings in place, that they shouldn't have to do this, because why would they? It should be secure by default. And it just makes me so upset that all these little places that really rely on Microsoft security and it being secure by default, and they have no way of knowing like what's safe to turn on and off and what should they do. And so they're just really getting screwed over by Microsoft's decisions that, put money in their own pockets over the good of everybody else. So yeah, that's my little soapbox there. I don't think they're going to change it. I think something bad will have to happen before they say, oh, this was a stupid idea. But I don't see it changing in the foreseeable future.
We're seeing that now with the latest AP29 that just dropped this past week with regard to the RDP. So the RDP research that kind of got dropped a little while ago. Now APT29 used RDP files to spearfish a number of government agencies, kind of across a lot of different industries as well. And RDP files just fly by default. I know it's not necessarily cloud specific, but RDP file extensions pass through mail gateways. They pass through mail clients, and then just by default, you could route a lot of on-prem machines drives to the server. So they were leveraging that just by default. I'm with you. I'm very opposed to them ever actually changing that.
And there's other things too, like direct send, right? Where you can just telnet to the SMTP servers and send it. It drops you right in past all of their mail protections. So, I mean, it's ridiculous that it exists, because this is from the 90s. This shouldn't be happening in 2024. Like, this is ridiculous. They had this figured out in 1995. So why is Microsoft doing something dumb like this that's affecting every single one of their customers unless you make some convoluted mail flow rule to fix it? And that's not easy to do. I don't think most organizations do fix it. They just deal with it. But it's ridiculous because you can impersonate any user in an organization to another user in that organization. You can't cross tenants with it, but you could be the CEO of your organization, or you can be the IT person asking somebody else to do something. And it's so easy, and it autofills your profile picture, everything, so it all looks legit unless you take action to prevent it. So it's ridiculous.
You could even send it from Azure Cloud Shell. So
Oh
your
yeah,
source
right.
IP, so your
Yeah.
source IP bypasses the whole spam house rule.
Yeah, yeah, it's fantastic. And not fantastic at all, but it's yeah.
And some of the defaults, even on like workstations, for instance, too, are still it's still not great. You know, just for instance, native SSH that's available on Windows 11. Past couple tests that I've been on, I've been able to establish a reverse SOX tunnel back to just attacker infrastructure, and then it's like, okay, no C2 payload, no nothing. I now have an established tunnel connected in from the outside, so there's still problems in that landscape too as well, just not the defaults in Azure. I'd probably say one of my biggest complaints that probably upsets me the most is when IR teams go in and it's a cloud IR, and then they immediately discovered that unified access logging had never been turned on. So there's even stuff down to that level that creates a lot of issues whenever it comes to just seeing how the attacker got in and how to remediate and fix so that it just doesn't happen again. So we got a couple other ones coming in. Oh, one just disappeared on me. It was around CIS.
Yeah, sorry, I answered that one. We can speak to it real quick.
Oh,
Is on the pen testing side of things, we don't focus as much on the CIS benchmarks themselves with pass fail. We're more focused on trying to find actionable paths through the environment. So it's not so much a dotting I's and crossing T's. We do have a config review service that will do that, and it'll go in depth with all the CIS benchmarks and rate you on those. But on the pen testing side of things, we see the two sides of the same coin, but slightly different goals.
so we have one around Stig Viewer, which is a solid start. I don't know if this is more of a question or a general statement. Stig viewers are good. CIS benchmarks are obviously good. These are all like config review items, but they're definitely stuff that you should be paying attention and looking at. Those benchmarks, you just set up a free CIS account, and then you can manually download those PDFs and review those benchmark guidance. That's always good. This is a good one. How do you stay updated on the latest attack techniques in cloud pen testing? So for me, I follow two platforms. X, formerly Twitter, is definitely one of them. I use the notification feature to certain accounts. Microsoft Threat Intelligence, some of really just some of the top cloud researchers that are out there. I'll tag those accounts, and generally, whenever they tweet out information, that's really kind of how I find out about them. It's a lot of information to absorb. I'm pen testing during the day, so more than likely I see it. I'll flag it, and then I probably have some stuff to review later on in the evening. But that's pretty much how I kind of stay up to date on the latest attacker techniques is between LinkedIn and X.
Yeah, I kind of follow some people on Twitter, X, mostly. I don't do as much LinkedIn myself. There's also a couple of cloud newsletters that some people that are very kind put together weekly. I'll go through those and on a weekly basis, kind of keep up to date with things. Also, just kind of different social groups of people I've met at conferences, stuff like that, keeping connections and conversations flowing type thing.
Yeah, I'd say on my end, I like to try to spin up cloud environments. Like I remember when I first got started with OCI, I had never seen OCI. I've seen it in tools from time to time, but setting up like a free trial and spinning up resources and then just trying to kind of mimic what I was doing in AWS, for instance, because those two environments are really kind of similar in respect to how I approach, like from a technical perspective, digging into the resources. Um, and so it's kind of one and the same. So I've tried to focus on like the free trials and spend time. Also there's a lot of goats, a lot of cloud goats. So there's a lot of different open source repos where they'll spin up vulnerable environments within the cloud provider that you're wanting to dig into, and you could hack on real challenges. And a lot of those real challenges are built off of what we see in the real world engagement. So yeah, that's what I would say I would do.
So this is an interesting question. Does TrustedSec work with company security teams to train internal red resources and transfer knowledge and experience? So I've been on purple team engagements. And for those that are on call that may not know what a purple team is, we take red and blue and kind of combine them together, where we have an attacker with pen testing experience out in the cloud. We will perform attacks. We will work with the blue team. We have people on our side that are familiar with different type of SIM capabilities. And I'll generate that attacker-based telemetry. We'll pick just basically a list of just high-level targets. And by high-level targets, I mean the things that people are most concerned about. Token theft is definitely up there. For example, if I'm able to perform token theft via social engineering or whatever, what does that look like in terms of logs? I think those are really excellent opportunities, and especially a live fire exercise to see how well your SOC is going to be able to react to those types of events, or even if they won't see them at all. So in terms of training, I love purple team exercises because there's a lot of value and benefit that I think everybody gets out of those. I even get benefit out of them for me because I'm able to look at different queries on maybe how I'm able to evade stuff the next time and so forth. So um, that's some of my answer on internal red resources and transfer of knowledge experience. I don't know if Patrick or Mike, if you have any additional things to really kind of add on to that.
Yeah, I've helped with some purple engagements as well. We also have some red team training stuff that I believe we do is also, but sales individuals will be able to kind of speak best about that. I'm not sure if Edwin or Mike, you know.
No, I don't. I'm not. I'm not really super sure on what we do have. I know on the red team side, I know it's not cloud specific, but I know on the red team side, we've done some stuff where we've helped organizations kind of build out their internal red team, guess team, I guess per se. Maybe trying to get some ground roots going in an organization, but outside of that, I don't really know.
So one of the other questions that really kind of came in was, does migrating cloud apps to serverless architecture increase security? I think it's probably going to depend on how you're migrating those, how those systems are being built. One of my favorite things to do whenever deployments happen in the cloud is a log gets created whenever those deployments happen. And a lot of enterprises have moved to automating the deployment of cloud assets. Terraform, for instance, is one of the major players with that because you're automating a sysadmin's job where they don't have to click next 10 different times to deploy out a cloud asset. And I've had instances where some people have deployed out architecture, whether it's serverless, VMs, whatnot, and then a plain text credential gets stored in those logs, and then we're able to use them. I use microburst to pull that information out because it aggregates all the logs for me. and then I can use grep in my Linux terminal, and I can start looking and parsing through the information very, very quickly to see if that kind of stuff is going on, because those logs can be very, very huge. So I don't think anything is impervious to hackers. If it exists and it runs code, they're going to find a way. So that's really kind of my statement as far as serverless goes.
Yeah.
Actually,
Oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Mike.
I think we're going to say the same thing, but just different environments. Go for it. So I was just going to just kind of add in. I see a huge push to serverless. So this is I think the push is probably more on the cost savings associated with it, not so much the security aspect of it. I could be wrong. However, I do see a huge push to serverless, but when you get into the technical details of kind of like looking at serverless, it's really just the same code, just kind of uplifted into lightweight serverless architecture. The problems that I'm seeing though are a lot of times these serverless functions are provisioned with environment variables, for instance, or config files in the same regard that they would have on-prem. And so you're really just transferring the security issues to a serverless architecture. And so one of my go-tos, for instance, is as soon as I land in an environment, I'm sending a really wide net. So I'm running my reconnaissance, and a lot of times I'm just trying to grab as much information about those resources that I can across all of the accounts. And depending on how it's set up, that could take a really long time, or it could take a really quick opportunity. But like with GCP, you could organize these in different structures. So when you start looking at the serverless architecture under an account, my go-to is what's the environment variables, what are they configured with, and can I get access to the code, because there's either going to be hard-coded credentials or some sort of config file that's being loaded from somewhere. 9 times out of 10, if I have a lot of serverless architecture in an environment, there's usually always some sort of plaintext credential in the metadata, whether that be the environment variables for serverless functions, or even the metadata associated with like a compute resource. And so when you do that and you're uplifting into these, I don't think it's necessarily making it more secure. I think you're just transferring the risk. That's what I would say.
Yeah, and that's pretty similar to what I was going to say, that it definitely changes the landscape of your environment. Whereas before you might have had your application running in a few different EC2 instances and everything, but now it's running in 14 different Lambdas and, you know, a couple ECS tasks and a few like Kubernetes images maybe, you know, so that does change the security landscape as well, because now you have 14 different roles that are running as well for just as functions, and the same for the ECS and similar for EKS. It increases technical complexity for the entire thing, which introduces potentially security misconfigurations in areas that we can look at to maybe leverage our initial foothold or additional access. So it can, because if I gain access to a specific function, only one resource, if it's well defined and I'm not able to get any, I just don't automatically have access to the other 13 functions, so to say. I'd have to figure out a way to pivot into those. So it can, but similar to deploying traditional resources, if you're just putting plain text passwords in environmental variables, in the metadata, in the code, in flat files, then they could potentially be accessed in the same way. So it comes to good deployment hygiene, and more so, I think.
So we have one more question that popped in. This will probably be our last one for the day. I know we're getting 10 minutes out to the top of the hour. I'm always concerned that the pendulum is going to swing back to on-prem after some future big cloud breach. Is this unfounded? So there's two things. The first thing I see is I do see some enterprises clawing back from the cloud back to on-prem. There's multiple reasons for that. Probably one of the top reasons, other than security, is just cost. Some will find themselves that they scaled out in the cloud. The bills had gotten outrageously expensive, and then they end up crawling back to on-prem so that they have a more predictable spend for some of their server workload life cycles. That's probably one of the common things that I see. I've seen other breaches like the Okta breach, for instance, and people obviously continue to still use Okta. Nobody's immune to those types of things. I can't predict if there's going to be a big cloud breach that's going to affect everyone. I think what happened last summer with Midnight Blizzard and when the MSA signing key was stolen, that was particularly bad because the attackers could access mailboxes to multiple different organizations in a largely unrestricted fashion. So I think we've already seen some of those things. The bigger problem is just really around logging and being able to detect those things. So on some level, I see some people crawling back to on-prem because of costs. But then when you look at things like Office 365 and so forth, that would definitely be a big spend to try and go back to like perpetual licensing and removing resources from there. Because M365 in itself, other than Azure workloads, for me, is a very huge target and threat landscape, especially if you're storing data in like SharePoint Online, an attacker can start, exfiltrating data from those types of environments. So it's still going to be a problem, I think, regardless of how much you crawl back from on-prem.
Yeah, I've seen some conversation and talk around it regarding AWS, but it's kind of the similar cases. It depends on the customer's justifications or reasons that they're pursuing. Sometimes most of the times it seems to be billing. Sometimes it could be complexity or staff related, or they just end up they sort of were able to identify their core services and decided to outsource other services to other providers. It's kind of a mix, so it kind of depends. But as far as like a huge swing back to on-prem in general, I feel like that is really an individual business decision potentially, and as a entire community, it's hard to say because a lot of customers are just doing things that can only be done in cloud. Some aren't, so it's really kind of a tough one to answer.
Yeah, and maybe not going back to on-prem, but definitely switching in between cloud providers, especially with a lot of the frameworks that are deploying like infrastructure. When you start running in Ansible and Terraform and you start automating a lot of the infrastructure as code, you could kind of rapidly switch between providers. So there's probably some movement there. I don't, at least on the GCP side, I don't see, or even on the OCI side, I don't see it. I see a lot of upkeep moving from on-prem into these environments, which is a lot of the testing, I would say, that people are concerned with. I mean, a lot of the tests when I sit down in the kickoff call and I'm asking them, hey, what are your concerns? What's keeping you up at night? A lot of the answers that I'm getting are, well, we're moving on-prem into the cloud and we don't know. We're just concerned. We don't know what we don't know. And so that's why they want the testing done. So I'm still seeing the migration the other way. I'm not even sure I've seen any go back to the on-prem.
I'll answer this one quick question, then I'm going to cut it off because this is a very, very good question. What are the most common ways an environment is getting breached from outside the org if the company is using Microsoft 365 with MFA? I'm going to say my top thing is social engineering and token theft. That will immediately, when you get that token back, it is enriched with an MFA claim. And depending on whatever it goes to, even if it's from a low privileged user, an attacker can do some very, very significant, I don't want to say damage, but they can get some very significant reconnaissance efforts done with just a single token, depending on where it goes through. And that's where MFA is really getting bypassed, is that social engineering aspect and token theft, because a lot of tenants that I test are not they're not hardened enough in conditional access where they're preventing that external token theft from occurring. So with that, we are getting close to the top of the hour. I want to thank all the attendees for their time today to listen to us, to submit your questions so that we could get them answered properly for you. So thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon / evening wherever you're logging in from. Thank you.